The transmission arrived at Earth's Unified Space Command on a quiet Tuesday morning when most of the staff were still drinking their first cups of coffee and checking overnight reports from the orbital stations scattered across the solar system. Ambassador Kathura of the Volanti Collective appeared on every screen across the facility without warning, and her image caused immediate panic among the security teams who thought they were under some kind of cyber attack. She was a slender being with luminescent blue skin that seemed to glow from within, and 4 delicate arms that moved gracefully as she spoke, and her large eyes were filled with tears that sparkled like diamonds in the artificial light of her ship. "We beg for your assistance," Kathura said through the universal translator that converted her musical language into English, and her voice was trembling with fear and desperation that needed no translation to understand. "The Corax Dominion has invaded our homeworld, and our defensive forces have fallen after only 3 days of fighting, and we have tried negotiating with the other species in the Galactic Assembly, but none will intervene because they fear the Corax too greatly to risk their own worlds, Commander." Lisa Hartwell watched the transmission from her office aboard the orbital station Horizon that hung above Earth like a silver guardian, and she had spent 30 years in the military, surviving 3 major conflicts on Earth before humanity reached the stars and began exploring the vast darkness between worlds. She was a woman in her late 40s with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun and sharp eyes that had seen too much death and too much suffering to be surprised by anything anymore. Lisa knew desperation when she saw it, and the alien ambassador was absolutely terrified. She recorded a return transmission and sent it across the void, knowing it would take hours to reach the Volanti ship due to the enormous distance between them. "Why come to us?" she asked in a calm and measured voice that hid her own uncertainty about the situation. "We are newcomers to the galactic community, and we barely have a fleet capable of defending our own system, let alone fighting a war in someone else's territory." Kathura's response came 7 hours later, and Lisa had barely slept while waiting for it. "Because you are Deathworlders," the ambassador said, and the word carried a weight that Lisa did not fully understand at first. "Your planet and your biology and your history terrify the Galactic Assembly in ways you cannot imagine, and the Corax do not know what you are capable of because no one does, and neither do we truly understand what humans are." The ambassador paused and wiped the tears from her face with 2 of her 4 hands, while the other 2 gripped the console in front of her. "But we are dying, Commander, and our cities are burning, and our children are being taken as slaves, and we have nothing left to lose by asking the monsters of Earth for help." Lisa turned to her aide, Lieutenant Danny Ruiz, who was a young man barely 25 years old, with dark hair and nervous eyes, who had graduated top of his class at the academy, but had never seen real combat or experienced the horror of war firsthand. "Get me a secure line to Earth Command immediately," she ordered, "and pull everything we have on the Corax Dominion from the intelligence database." Danny nodded quickly and hurried away to complete his tasks while Lisa stared at the frozen image of Kathura on her screen. Deathworlders had heard the term mentioned during the first contact negotiations 18 months ago, when the Volanti had arrived in Earth's solar system and nearly fled in terror upon detecting human life signs. The galactic community had a classification system for planets and the species that evolved on them, and Earth fell into a category that most aliens considered impossible for developing intelligent life. High gravity that crushed the bodies of visitors from lighter worlds and extreme temperature variations that ranged from frozen wastelands to burning deserts, and a toxic atmosphere filled with a corrosive gas called oxygen that most species could not breathe. And then there were the predators. Earth was filled with creatures designed by evolution to kill and consume other creatures, and humans had risen to dominance not despite this environment, but because of it. They were persistence hunters who could chase prey for hours until it collapsed from exhaustion, and they were toolmakers who crafted weapons from stone and metal and fire, and they were survivors who had endured ice ages and plagues and famines and wars against each other. To the rest of the galaxy, humans were nightmares given flesh and bone, and now those nightmares were being asked to go to war. Lisa spent the next 3 days in meetings with Earth Command and political leaders and military strategists who argued endlessly about whether humanity should intervene in an alien conflict that did not directly threaten Earth. Some argued that it was not their problem, and that risking human lives for aliens they barely knew was foolish and dangerous. Others pointed out that the Korax Dominion had already conquered 12 systems and showed no signs of stopping, and that eventually they would reach Earth whether humans wanted to fight them or not. Better to fight them now when we have allies than later when we stand alone, argued Admiral Victor Reyes during a heated conference call that lasted 6 hours. Lisa agreed with him completely. The vote was close, but in the end, humanity decided to answer the call for help, and the news spread across Earth like wildfire, igniting a wave of patriotism and fear. In equal measure, recruitment centers were flooded with volunteers who wanted to be part of the first human military force to fight beyond the solar system, and factories that had been building ships for exploration were quickly converted to produce weapons and armor and supplies for war. Lisa was given command of the expedition, and she spent every waking moment preparing for a mission that no human had ever attempted before. She studied everything the Volante had provided about the Korax, including their ships and their weapons and their tactics and their culture, and she found them to be a brutal species that valued strength above all else and showed no mercy to those they conquered. But she also found weaknesses, that the Volante had been too gentle and too peaceful to exploit. The Korax had never faced an enemy that thought like a predator, because most species in the galaxy had evolved on worlds far kinder than Earth, where survival did not require the same ruthless instincts that humans had developed over millions of years. They expected their enemies to fight defensively and to surrender when the situation became hopeless, and to value their own lives above victory. Humans were different. Humans had fought wars where soldiers charged into certain death for the sake of their comrades, and where entire cities had chosen destruction over surrender, and where victory was pursued with a single-minded determination that bordered on madness. The Korax had no idea what was coming for them. 3 weeks after the transmission arrived, the assault carrier Relentless was loaded with troops and supplies and weapons and launched from Earth's orbital shipyard with 4 escort destroyers flanking it like wolves protecting their pack leader. Lisa watched the fleet depart from the observation deck of Horizon Station and felt a mixture of pride and terror that she had not experienced since her first combat deployment decades ago. May God help them, Danny said quietly beside her. Lisa shook her head slowly. God is not the one the Korax need to worry about, she replied. The Deathworlders are coming. The assault carrier Relentless dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of Volante space after 3 weeks of journey through the darkness between stars, and the crew felt the familiar lurch in their stomachs as normal physics reasserted itself around them. Colonel San Marino stood on the bridge watching the tactical display that showed their position relative to the alien homeworld that was still several hours away at sublight speeds. He was a broad-shouldered man of 42 with skin weathered by years of service in harsh environments and a scar running down his left cheek that he had earned during the Buenos Aires uprising 15 years ago, when the city had torn itself apart in civil conflict. Sam had volunteered for this mission without hesitation because he believed that humanity had a responsibility to help those who could not help themselves, and because he had grown tired of fighting other humans when there were real enemies in the universe. First contact with Allied forces in approximately 2 hours, reported Lieutenant Commander Nina Vance, who served as his second-in-command and handled the tactical operations of the ship. She was tall and dark-skinned with close-cropped hair and a reputation for remaining calm under any circumstances that would send other officers into panic. The Volanthi are sending an escort to guide us to their emergency command center on one of the outer moons. Sam nodded and studied the display more closely. And the Corax forces? Holding position in the blockade. Formation around the Volanthi homeworld? Nina replied while pulling up the sensor data on the main screen. Preliminary scans show approximately 60 warships of various sizes supported by troop transports and supply vessels. She paused and looked at him with an expression that was carefully neutral. They also have ground forces already deployed on the surface, controlling major population centers and holding civilian hostages. Sam absorbed this information without visible reaction, though internally he was calculating odds and possibilities and strategies, 60 against 7. He muttered while rubbing the scar on his cheek, which was an old habit he had never managed to break. I have definitely had worse odds than this. Nina raised an eyebrow at him. Have you actually, sir? No, not really, but saying it out loud makes me feel better about the situation. The first meeting with the Volanthi military commanders took place aboard their command station, which orbited a small moon far from the Corax blockade. Sam brought a security detail of 6 soldiers, but ordered them to remain outside the meeting room because he did not want to intimidate their new allies any more than necessary. It did not matter. The Volanthi were clearly terrified of the humans from the moment they entered the room. General Torvin was an elderly male with pale blue skin that had faded with age and 4 arms that trembled slightly as he rose to greet the human delegation. His species was fragile by human standards, with hollow bones that would shatter under Earth's gravity and muscles so weak that a human child could overpower an adult Volanthi without effort. Their senses were dulled compared to humans who had evolved alongside wolves and tigers and snakes and every other predator that Earth had produced over billions of years. When Sam extended his hand to shake in the traditional human greeting, Torvin recoiled visibly and stepped backward with fear obvious in his large, watery eyes. Forgive me, Torvin said through his translator device. Physical contact among your kind is overwhelming to my species, and your body temperature alone is nearly lethal to us. Sam withdrew his hand immediately and kept his expression friendly and non-threatening. No offense taken, General, he said in a calm voice. We are here to help your people, not to make anyone uncomfortable. He gestured for Torvin to sit down and took his own seat at a careful distance from the alien commander. Please tell us everything about the current situation on your homeworld. Torvin spent the next 2 hours explaining how the Corax had attacked without warning and how the Volanthi defense fleet had been destroyed in the first engagement, and how the ground forces had surrendered rather than see their cities destroyed. The Volanthi were a peaceful species that had not fought a war in over 3,000 years, and they had no experience with the kind of brutal, efficient violence that the Corax employed. You truly believe you can defeat them? Torvin asked after finishing his briefing, and his voice was filled with doubt and desperate hope in equal measure. They have conquered 12 systems and never lost a single campaign, and they are ruthless and efficient and without mercy. Sam glanced at Nina, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. With respect, General, the Corax have never fought humans before. Sam replied, We wrote the book on ruthless and efficient. He paused and smiled, though there was no warmth in the expression, only the cold determination of a predator sizing up its prey. And mercy? We saved that for after the war is won. The following days were spent in intensive preparation as human and Volanthi forces worked together to plan the counteroffensive. Sam quickly discovered that the Volanthi had valuable intelligence about Corax tactics and ship configurations, but lacked the aggressive mindset needed to exploit the weaknesses they had identified. The Corax expected their enemies to fight defensively because that was how every species they had encountered behaved when facing superior numbers. They would establish a blockade and wait for the enemy to attack them in a predictable frontal assault that could be easily defeated. Sam had no intention of being predictable. He divided his small fleet into 3 groups and assigned each group a specific role in the battle plan that he developed with Nina. Over countless hours of simulation and analysis, the destroyers would split into 2 flanking forces, while the Relentless would charge directly at the center of the enemy formation, drawing their attention and fire. "This is insane," said Captain Omar Hassan, who commanded one of the destroyer groups and had served with Sam in 3 previous campaigns. "We are outnumbered nearly 10 to 1. Sam nodded in agreement. "Yes, it is absolutely insane, and the Korax will never expect it because no sane species would attempt something this stupid." He grinned at Omar with genuine amusement. "Good thing humans are not entirely sane." The human soldiers spent their final hours before battle in different ways, according to their personalities, and believe some wrote letters to loved ones back on Earth that would be transmitted if they did not survive. Some prayed to whatever gods they believed in. Some simply sat in silence and prepared their minds for the violence to come. Nina found Sam in the observation lounge, staring out at the stars that stretched endlessly in every direction. "Any second thoughts?" she asked while standing beside him. Sam shook his head slowly. "These aliens asked for help when no one else would come," he said quietly. "They called us monsters and Deathworlders, and they were still desperate enough to beg for our assistance." He turned to look at her with eyes that had seen too much death and too much suffering. "We are going to show them what those monsters can do when they fight for something other than themselves." The first engagement of the war came 6 days after the human fleet arrived in Volanthi space, near a small moon that orbited the alien homeworld. Korak's patrol fleet of 8 ships detected the human convoy approaching and moved to intercept. With the casual confidence of predators who had never encountered anything capable of challenging them, the enemy vessels were larger than the human destroyers, with hulls covered in dark armor plates and weapons batteries that bristled from every surface like the spines of some angry beast. They expected an easy victory against these strange newcomers from a distant world. They were completely and utterly wrong. Colonel San Marino watched the enemy formation on his tactical display as they approached in a standard wedge pattern that was designed to concentrate firepower on a single target. "They are not changing course or breaking formation," Nina observed from her station. "They think we are going to turn and run or surrender." Sam nodded while strapping himself into his command chair and activating the restraints that would keep him in place during high-speed maneuvers. "Then let us show them how wrong they are," he said calmly. "All ships execute attack pattern Delta on my command." The human fleet had practiced this maneuver dozens of times during the journey from Earth, and every captain knew their role perfectly. 4 destroyers split into 2 groups of 2 and accelerated away from the Relentless at angles that would bring them around to flank the enemy formation. Meanwhile, the assault carrier charged directly at the center of the Korak's patrol fleet with all weapons powered and ready to fire. "They are increasing speed to intercept us," Nina reported. "Weapons are charging, and they will be in firing range in approximately 4 minutes. Sam smiled grimly. "Good, let them come closer." The Korak's commander clearly believed that the single large human ship was attempting some kind of desperate ramming attack and ordered his vessels to concentrate fire on the Relentless. It was exactly what Sam wanted them to do. "All batteries target the lead vessel," he ordered. "Fire everything we have on my mark." The weapons officers acknowledged his command, and the ship hummed with power as the main guns charged to full capacity. The Korak ships were built for intimidation as much as function, with massive frames designed to terrify enemies into submission before the fighting even began. Their weapons were powerful but slow to cycle because they were designed for extended bombardments against stationary targets rather than rapid exchanges with maneuvering. Opponents, the humans, had studied every engagement the Volanthi had recorded and knew exactly how the enemy would fight. Mark, the Relentless unleashed its main guns, which were kinetic accelerators that fired tungsten slugs at a significant fraction of the speed of light. The first salvo crossed the distance between the ships in less than a second and struck the lead Korak's vessel before its shields could fully activate. The enemy ship was simply not designed to withstand that kind of concentrated kinetic force delivered so quickly and so accurately. It broke apart in a silent explosion of metal and atmosphere and bodies that tumbled through the void. The remaining Korak ships hesitated, and their formation wavered as the commanders tried to understand what had just happened in their entire history of conquest, spanning hundreds of years and dozens of species. They had never lost a vessel so quickly in combat. That moment of hesitation cost them everything. The flanking destroyers opened fire from two directions simultaneously, and their point defense systems tracked and eliminated incoming missiles, while their own weapons hammered the enemy hulls with relentless precision. Captain Omar Hassan led his group against the right flank and destroyed two enemy ships in rapid succession before they could reorient their weapons. Captain Diane Palmer, commanding the left flank group, crippled another vessel with a concentrated barrage that knocked out its engines and weapons. The battle became chaos as the Korak's formation collapsed and individual ships tried to fight or flee without coordination. Sam pushed the Relentless forward into the heart of the melee, and his crew fought with the focused aggression of predators who had finally found worthy prey. Another enemy vessel destroyed, Nina reported while tracking the carnage on her display. Two more are disabled and drifting. Within 12 minutes, 5 more Korak ships were eliminated or crippled beyond combat effectiveness. The remaining 2 vessels broke formation and fled at maximum speed toward the main fleet protecting Volanthi Prime. Should we pursue? Omar asked over the fleet communication channel, and his voice was eager for more fighting. Sam shook his head, even though Omar could not see the gesture. No, let them go, he ordered. Let them run back to their commanders and tell them exactly what happened here today. Nina looked at him with curiosity. You want them to spread fear? Sam nodded slowly while watching the fleeing enemy ships disappear into the distance. Fear is a weapon too, and sometimes it is more effective than guns and missiles. The aftermath of the battle was a scene of destruction that drifted silently through space. Debris from the shattered Korak's vessels tumbled in all directions, mixed with bodies and equipment and fragments of hull plating. The human ships had suffered damage, as well, with scorched armor and depleted ammunition and wounded crew members who were rushed to the medical bays. But they had won 7 ships against 8, and they had destroyed or disabled 6 enemy vessels while losing none of their own. Sam ordered the fleet to hold position while repairs were made and the wounded were treated. He also ordered the communication officers to broadcast a message to the main Korak's fleet on all frequencies. This is Colonel Sam Marino of the Earth Expeditionary Force, he said while standing on the bridge, surrounded by his exhausted but victorious crew. We have just destroyed your patrol fleet, and we are coming for the rest of you next. He paused to let the words sink in. You have one chance to withdraw from Volanthi space and release all prisoners and hostages without further bloodshed. Another pause. If you refuse, we will hunt you down and destroy every ship and every soldier and every trace of your presence in this system. He ended the transmission and turned to Nina. How long before they respond? Nina checked her console and made some calculations. Assuming they received the message immediately, they will need time to verify what happened and consult with their commanders. She looked up at him. My guess is they will attack us with everything they have within the next 48 hours. Sam nodded with satisfaction. Because that is exactly what I am counting on. The space battle was only the beginning of the campaign because the Koraks had already established a strong presence on Volanthi Prime, with ground forces occupying major cities and holding millions of civilians as hostages against orbital bombardment. A conventional assault from space would result in catastrophic civilian casualties and would defeat the entire purpose of the liberation missions. So the humans decided to do something unconventional. Sergeant First Class Katie Brooks led the first reconnaissance team to the surface of Volanthi Prime, dropping through the atmosphere in stealth pods that were designed to avoid detection by enemy sensors. She was 31 years old with short brown hair and steady hands that never trembled. Even under the most intense pressure, Katie had served in 3 different combat zones on Earth before volunteering for the Expeditionary Force, and she had the kind of quiet confidence that made younger soldiers trust her instincts without question. Her team consisted of 5 other soldiers who had been handpicked for their skills and their ability to work together in dangerous situations. Corporal Eddie Lane was their communications specialist with a photographic memory that allowed him to recall maps and codes and frequencies without consulting any devices. Private First Class Maria Santos served as their medic, and she had saved more lives in combat than she could count using skills learned in the worst emergency rooms on Earth. Private Hector Dunn was the youngest at 22 years old, but he was also the best marksman Katie had ever seen, with an almost supernatural ability to hit targets at extreme distances. Specialist Yolanda Price handled demolitions and had a talent for creative destruction that bordered on artistic expression. Private Ben Short was their pack mule who carried more equipment than seemed physically possible for one person and never complained about the weight. The stealth pods descended through this alien atmosphere at night when darkness would provide additional cover for their insertion. Katie watched through the small viewport as the ground rushed up toward them and silver leaf forests stretched across the landscape below. They landed in a clearing 3 kilometers from the occupied city of Valora, which had been a center of Volanthi culture and learning before the invasion. The alien trees were tall and strange, with bark smooth as glass and leaves that chimed softly in the wind. Like tiny bells to the Volanthi, this forest was a sacred place of peace and contemplation, where their ancestors had walked for thousands of years. Katie, it was excellent cover for a military operation. Comes check, she whispered while tapping her earpiece and scanning the surrounding trees for any sign of movement. 5 acknowledgments came back immediately, and she felt a small measure of relief knowing her team had landed safely. Eddie, establish a secure channel to the fleet and let them know we are on the ground, she ordered. Everyone else spread out and establish a perimeter. The team moved through the alien forest like ghosts, using hand signals and covering each other's movements with practiced precision. The Korax had superior numbers and technology, but they had never faced an enemy that hunted the way humans did, silently and patiently, and with a predator's instinct for finding weakness. Over the following week, Katie's team gathered intelligence about enemy positions and patrol routes and communications frequencies. They mapped the defenses around Valora and identified key targets that would need to be destroyed before a full assault could succeed. They also made contact with Volanthi resistance fighters who had been hiding in the forest since the invasion and emerged from their concealment when they learned that humans had arrived. The aliens were terrified of their new allies at first, because they had heard the stories about Deathworlders and expected monsters without mercy or compassion, but desperation overcame fear, and soon they were working together, sharing information and planning for the liberation of their world. Nalith was a young Volanthi woman who had lost her entire family in the initial invasion when Korax soldiers had burned her village to punish the inhabitants for resisting. She had been hiding in the forest for weeks, surviving on whatever food she could find and waiting for death to find her. Instead, the humans found her. You move so quietly, Nalith whispered one night while watching Kitty and her team prepare for a scouting mission, and you can see in the darkness without any light. She paused, and her large eyes studied Katie with a mixture of fear and fascination. are all Deathworlders. Like you? Katie smiled gently and kept her voice soft so as not to frighten the fragile alien. We evolved on a dangerous world where everything wanted to kill us, she explained. So we learned to be quiet and to see in the dark and to fight without mercy when we had to. She reached out slowly and touched Nelith's arm with the lightest possible pressure. But we also learned to protect those who cannot protect themselves, because that is what makes us human. The counterattack began at dawn on the 8th day, when the first light of the alien sun was just touching the horizon. Human special forces struck 23 targets simultaneously across the occupied zone, hitting power stations and communication hubs and ammunition depots and command posts. Corax were completely unprepared for this kind of coordinated assault because every species they had conquered before had fought in predictable formations that could be countered with superior firepower. They had never faced an enemy that attacked from every direction at once with small teams of soldiers who appeared from nowhere and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. Katie's team was assigned to destroy the main power generator that supplied the Corax command center in the heart of Velorathi, moved through the city streets in the pre-dawn darkness, avoiding patrols and eliminating sentries. With silent efficiency, Yolanda planted her charges on the generator housing while the rest of the team provided security and watched for any sign of enemy response. Charges set. Yolanda reported through the comm channel. Ready to blow on your command. Katie waited until she received confirmation that the other teams were in position. All teams, this is Alpha 1, she said quietly. Execute on my mark. She took a deep breath and looked at her soldiers, who were ready and eager for the fight. Mark. 23 explosions ripped through the occupied zone simultaneously, and the Corax command structure collapsed into chaos as communications went dead and power failed. And ammunition stores erupted in secondary blasts. Colonel Marino led the main assault force that dropped from orbit in the confusion, landing in the central plaza of Velora with 500 soldiers who immediately engaged the disoriented enemy. The fighting was brutal but brief because humans excelled at close-quarters combat in ways that shocked the Corax soldiers. The aliens were larger and stronger individually, but they had never faced an enemy that matched them in aggression and exceeded them in teamwork and tactical flexibility. By sunset, Velora was liberated, and the Corax survivors were fleeing toward their evacuation ships. Katie stood in the plaza surrounded by cheering Volanti civilians who had emerged from their hiding places to celebrate their freedom. Nelith was among them, and she approached Katie with tears streaming down her face. You came for us, the alien woman said in a voice choked with emotion. You fought and died for people who are not even your own species. Katie looked at the destruction around them and the bodies of fallen soldiers, both human and Corax. We are all people, she replied simply. That is enough reason to fight. The Corax Dominion sued for peace 6 weeks after the liberation of Velora, when it became clear that they could not defeat the human forces. Regardless of how many ships and soldiers they committed to the fight, they had lost 2/3 of their fleet in a series of engagements that demonstrated the terrifying effectiveness of human tactics and technology. Every ground force they had deployed to Volanti Prime had been destroyed or captured by human soldiers who fought with a ferocity that the Corax had never encountered in their centuries of conquest. Commander Lisa Hartwell traveled from Earth to oversee the final negotiations personally, because she wanted to look the enemy in the eyes when they surrendered. The meeting took place aboard a neutral station at the edge of Volanti space, with representatives from both sides and observers from several other species who wanted to witness this historic moment. Lisa entered the chamber flanked by Colonel San Marino and a security detail of human soldiers who stood at attention with weapons ready. The Corax High Commander sat at the opposite end of the table, and he was a massive reptilian creature with scales like polished obsidian and eyes that burned with hatred and humiliation. His name was Tharkus, and he had commanded the invasion force that had conquered a dozen worlds before encountering humanity. Now he sat in chains waiting to hear the terms of his defeat. You will withdraw all forces from Volanthi. Space immediately, Lisa said in a clear voice that carried through the chamber. Every ship and every soldier will leave within 30 standard days. Tharkus said nothing, but his clawed hands tightened on the arms of his chair. You will pay reparations to the Volanthi people for the destruction you have caused. Lisa continued. The exact amount will be determined by an independent tribunal, but it will be substantial. She leaned forward and locked eyes with the Korax commander. And you will sign a non-aggression pact that extends to all species under human protection for a period of 100 standard years. Tharkus finally spoke, and his voice was a low growl that vibrated through the translator. You are savages, he said with contempt dripping from every word. You fight without honor and without rules and without any respect for the traditions of warfare. Lisa did not flinch or look away. We fight to win, she replied calmly. There is a difference between honor and stupidity, and we learned that lesson a long time ago on our own world. She gestured to the treaty documents that lay on the table between them. Sign the agreement, and this war ends today with your people still possessing their homeworld and their civilization. She paused and let the silence stretch for several seconds. Refuse, and we will continue fighting until there is nothing left of the Korax dominion but a memory and a warning to others. Tharkus stared at her with hatred burning in his eyes, but he was not stupid enough to believe he could win. He reached out with one clawed hand and signed the treaty. The Galactic Assembly convened an emergency session 3 days later to address what they called the human question. Representatives from hundreds of species filled the enormous chamber and watched recordings of the war with a mixture of awe and terror. Species that had dismissed humanity as primitive newcomers to the galactic community now understood that they had made a terrible miscalculation. The Deathworlders had revealed themselves, and nothing would ever be the same. Ambassador Kefira addressed the assembly on behalf of the Volanthi Collective, and her voice rang through the chamber with an emotion that needed no translation. The humans came when no one else would answer our call for help, she said. They bled for our world, and they died for our people, and they asked nothing in return except our friendship. She paused and looked around the chamber at the thousands of watching faces. Call them Deathworlders if you wish, because that is what they are, and we will not deny the truth of their nature. Her voice grew stronger and prouder. But we call them friends, and we call them heroes, and we call them the saviors of our civilization. The chamber erupted in noise as representatives from different species argued about what this meant for the future of the galaxy. Some feared that humanity would become the new conquerors, replacing the Korax as the dominant military power. Others hoped that the humans would protect weaker species from aggression as they had protected the Volanthi, the bridge of the relentless, which now orbited Volanthi Prime. As part of a permanent defense agreement, Colonel Sam Marino watched the broadcast with his crew. Nina stood beside him with her arms crossed and an expression of thoughtful concern on her face. Do you think this changes anything? She asked, while the politicians argued on the screen. Sam considered the question carefully before answering. Humanity had spent its entire existence fighting against nature and against each other and against extinction itself. They had emerged from a world that tried to kill them at every turn, and they had not just survived but thrived and built civilizations and reached for the stars. Now the galaxy knew what that meant. Yeah, everything changes now, Sam said finally. The question is whether we change it for the better. He turned to look at Nina, and his expression was serious. We can be the monsters they fear, or we can be the protectors they need, and that choice is going to define humanity's future in this galaxy. Nina nodded slowly. And which one do you think we will choose? Sam smiled, and for the first time in weeks, there was genuine warmth in the expression. I think we will do what we have always done, he said. We will argue about it endlessly and make mistakes and learn from them and eventually figure out the right answer. He shrugged. That is what humans do. Outside the viewport, the stars stretched endlessly into the void and somewhere out. Their other species were watching and waiting and wondering what the Deathworlders would do next. The Volanthi had called them heroes, and the Corax had called them savages, and both descriptions contained truth. Humanity had proven that they could destroy their enemies with brutal efficiency, but they had also proven that they would sacrifice their own lives to protect strangers from another world. The galaxy would have to decide which aspect of human nature to focus on, and humanity would have to decide which aspect of themselves to embrace. The war was over, but the story of humanity among the stars was just beginning. Commander Lisa Hartwell watched the celebration from the observation deck of the orbital station and felt something she had not experienced in many years. Hope. The Deathworlders had come to the aid of those who could not defend themselves, and that meant something important about who they were as a Taos species. Maybe the universe was not such a dark and hostile place after all, or maybe it was, and humanity was exactly what it needed. Either way, they were going to find out together.